John, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really honored. Please pardon my voice. I'm suffering from, recovering from a cold. So I work with the Global Digital Inclusion Partnership, and I know that quite a number of you haven't heard of this because this is a new organization set up about 4 months ago, and it's actually laser focused on driving, we're trying to drive partnerships to ensure that the SDGs by 2030 are met. So specifically, we are looking at all the broadband and connectivity targets for 2030 in the 8 years time, and what needs to be done to ensure that these commitments that we've made as a country, as companies and as private sector and civil society are met. So we bring together private sector, civil society and governments to focus on driving down the cost of broadband, ensuring that there's meaningful access and sustainable access as well. And I will just quickly skip to a few things. I'm not sure what's happening. But generally, I don't know if it's on. Yeah, I think I'd read from here.
Is it back in there?
Yeah. So I just wanted to just speak to a few statistics, as you can see over here, and just to bring back home the conversation that we are having, that we know that about 2.7 billion people are offline. But on this board, I want us to focus on the $428 billion. That's the investment that's needed to connect everybody by 2030. And this investment is one that we need to really focus on. When we did this work with the ITU, this was just before COVID. So there's a possibility that the $428 billion is actually going to be more. But for now, this is based on the model that we worked with, the estimates that we have, $428 billion. And when it comes to Africa, it's about $109 billion in terms of infrastructure investment that is required. But then look at the loss of $1 trillion that you see over there. And this is what's the $1 trillion loss in GDP over the last decade by excluding women from the digital economy. So there's a business case to be made for connecting everyone, but then there's a bigger business case to be made for connecting not just anybody, but ensuring that we are intentional about bringing women into the digital economy. So when we ran a model that we developed, we found out that $1 trillion has been lost in the past decade from mainly 36 low and lower middle income countries. And so there's a need to focus not just on connecting everybody, but being intentional about connecting women as well. And then there is also the looking at a bit more detail about the $428 billion I spoke about earlier in terms of investment. And if you see the breakdown, you notice that it's not just about upgrading existing infrastructure, but we're also looking at the mobile, the capex that is needed, which is about $104 billion, and then also about skills and content. Because as Minister mentioned, when you connect people in the rural areas, there's a huge uptake. But then we also need to look at what kind of demand side business case is there to ensure that people can use the services that are there and use it to be able to generate a lot of content and also generate income as well. So there's a good need to look at this breakdown that we developed with the ITU. And then, of course, we also need to look at the conversation around climate change. And a number of the sites that are the infrastructure that is required, that we're all very excited about, what we've realized is that a lot of sites, particularly in developing regions, are still powered. There are a number of sites that are powered by electricity, but there are quite a number that is also powered off-grid. And then there is also generator, which of course increases the carbon footprint. So it's important to look at if we are looking at decisions that we're making, how many of the sites that are planning to roll out or making a case to to investors now, how many of these sites can we ensure that are going to meet the net zero emissions by 2030? There's a lot of money that is coming in because of the climate change movement. And I was at a conference 2 weeks ago, the funds conference, which was brought together a lot of asset managers, a lot of investors, and there was a key focus on, clean energy, a focus on how to ensure that they could meet the net zero emissions by 2030. So there is an opportunity there to see how we can make a stronger business case for the telecom sector, and also being able to ensure that we can attract some of this funding that is coming into the space. And this slide just talks about the investment breakdown by region, but I'll just skip it because I talked about Africa and other regions as well over here. So the solutions to consider. One of the challenges I've observed working with a number of countries is that there is a willpower by a number of ministers. So typically you have a digital or ICT minister who is very keen, but then we don't see a whole of government approach. Is a Minister of Finance on board? Is a Minister of Agriculture and Education on board? So having a very clear roadmap is one of the hurdles that we are seeing that is becoming, that is inherent in some of the challenges that we're seeing. So if the roadmap, you don't have a clear vision, one that is not just looking at just the infrastructure rollout, but also looking at how there's going to be a return on investment, how the demand side incentives are going to be generated. So Ministry of Agriculture talking about how to use some of the services that are going to be rolled out, education, government portals. If we don't have that whole of government approach, that tends to be a problem for investors, because they are looking at what is the roadmap, how can we make money, and what is the regulatory certainty that we can have. So I think this is one of the key things that I would really advise that we look at. There are a number of broadband plans and strategies, but often there has to be clarity about, how the funding and kind of ecosystem and environment that's going to encourage various players to come in. Sometimes a regulatory uncertainty is something that private sector would be a bit slow about. And then generally all the other players that are also looking at it would also be a bit hesitant. So please, a very clear roadmap is very important, and also one that also looks at the risks and also be able to anticipate and also provide some kind of confidence and surety to potential investors. The other thing about financing is about looking at a broad spectrum of financing. And, when we did this estimates about the 428 billion with the ITU, we looked at the 10-year horizon, and we did a breakdown between what private sector is likely to generate. Most of it is from private sector, 75%, and then 25% from public sector. And of course, public funds, we're looking at some of the development banks. We've seen that with the World Bank, for instance, financing quite a number of initiatives, IFC, and some other regional banks as well. But one of the areas that I want to talk about in terms of public financing is on the use of universal service funds. And I know that quite a number of you, honorable ministers here, have set up universal service and access funds within your various countries. But we did some research when I was working with the Alliance for Affordable Internet. And one thing we noticed was that in 2018, about $408 million of these funds were sitting unused. We haven't done any recent study. We're hoping that we can do that maybe this year to see whether things have changed. Why is that? What we noticed was that for a number of countries, the legislation is there, but then there hasn't been a way to show how the funds will be dispersed. So the money is being collected, all right, but then there's not been a setup, or there are problems in terms of regulation. There hasn't been a clear path. And then we also noticed with some of the funds that you can only disperse funds to those who have contributed into it. So some of the new players, like community networks, cannot access the funds. But the telcos are also not too keen to go into some of these rural areas. So there has to be a need to look at some of the setup of how the universal service funds have been structured, to see whether they are open to new players, whether in terms of the contributions into the fund, there's a need to look at a broader newer players as well. In some countries, you have utility providers also contributing into the fund, like in Senegal. We've seen that also in other countries, even in Portugal. So I think that we need to look at that opportunity there. Another one that we did a more recent study, and this is in 2021, and look at Latin America and the Caribbean. $7 billion. That is sitting, either it's been not used or being used for other purposes. And while some countries are doing particularly well, I think one of the biggest, the countries that shocked us the most was Brazil, which had about 6.7 billion. That was unused. And again, some of the legislative bottlenecks, some of the administrative bottlenecks, some of the regulatory bottlenecks. So there's money that can be unlocked that we need to look at when it comes to even some of these government funds. And I feel we need to look deep also. So I wanted to speak to some case studies that we've seen in terms of partnerships, which the Honorable Minister of Ghana mentioned, taking a loan facility and working with private sector players. But I believe Uganda is here, so probably can speak to this, but we've looked at the Bosco case. So Bosco is actually financed by the local Catholic Archdiocese, which I found very interesting. They bring together, it's a partnership, and they have solar sites. But the fact that the church is also going into connectivity was something that we found really interesting, and looking at rural areas as well. The Peru case, this is a partnership between Facebook, between the Inter-American Development Bank, and Telefonica. And again, this is the Internet para Todos, which is Internet for everyone. That's what it means. Look at the revenue sharing model as well. And again, this is another option that we could look at in terms of some of the rural rollout in rural areas. But these are all governed by the kind of strategies that we have. What kind of vision are we setting for each country, and being able to be open about it and give some kind of certainty. There's also Zenzeleni, and I'm sure those from South Africa are fully aware. These are community networks, and community-owned networks are sometimes the deployment for this is just about $25,000 to set up in a rural area, and can I just find out from various countries here, how many of you have community networks embedded in your broadband strategies? Community-owned or cooperatives in your broadband strategies? Only one. Two. So this is another opportunity. These are communities. So basically, how community networks, ISOC has been partnering with a number of small communities on this. So you come into a village, like in Zenzeleni, they're off-grid, about 3,000 people within that community. And then the setup for it in terms of the infrastructure and everything else is sponsored. And, and it's set up really very simply. So I think that this is one way we can look at community networks, and I'm happy to speak to you some more about it. So thank you, and I'm happy to also explore some more options that will come up.